Okay, so we're talking about how to determine what the section or the pericope is by looking at various markers that are there, but take advantage of what your English Bibles do as far as breaking it down. They will not always agree. And so for our purposes, that may actually be a good thing. While you're comparing the text with different translations, you can always compare the paragraph markers as well. Here are the three that actually are the best in identifying pericopes: the New American Standard, the New King James, and the NIV actually does a pretty decent job as far as identifying sections and pericopes. I like the way they laid the text out and clearly identified the beginning of a new paragraph. So you can use that. Yeah.
In Logos, they have passage analysis.
Right.
Where it kind of does it.
Yeah. The passage analysis feature of Logos is a very, very helpful feature. And actually, that is done with a little bit more of an exegetical slant to it. Just like when we were looking at Exodus 39, we saw the pattern of the idea of he made or they made. But we're talking about making this, moving to making that, to making something else. And then the summary of, okay, everything's been made, now what? Type breakdown. Well, that's exegetical. That's really identifying these pericopes that are coming out of the text. The Revised Standard and the ESV and/or the ESV really are probably the best, though, if you're doing Old Testament exegetical work and you're trying to identify a pericope.
When you say the NIV the best here overall, you mean as old and new combined, but you like the other ones best for the explicitly?
Right.
Okay.
But if you're just going to, not the NIV is best overall, but the NAS, the New King James, and the NIV are best overall.
Okay.
Those three are the three best.
As theme markers.
Right. But you will find when you start doing exegetical work that none of them have it right. And we're about to look at some illustrations of this. But do not allow yourself to become a slave to the textual markers that you find in your English Bible. Always keep an open mind. Always let the text warrant the way something should be divided. Remember that God did not provide the bold verse number or the separation of the text. There was nothing that God did in the original composition of these books that separated. So the fact that the New American Standard has verse 2 bold, verse 8 bold, that was just a designation from men. It is not something that's inspired, so we may or may not agree with that at all. Okay, so let's illustrate this by actually doing what we're talking about in determining a pericope. So I want to take Psalm 71 as our first example of this exercise. What divisions are found in your version, and what seems to be logical textual, a logical textual marker? Okay, so turn in your Bibles to Psalm 71. Now, the New American Standard has it broken down 1 through 4, 5 through 7, 8 through 11, 12 through 15, 16 through 17, 18, and 19. Now, does anybody have a translation that has it broken down differently than 1 through 4, 5 through 7, 8 through 11? Yeah, Nathan?
ESV, I'm going to give you the breakdown. How they do it?
Okay.
Okay, 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 16, and then the last chunk is together, 17 to 24.
Okay, anybody have something? Nathan, what do you got?
Got the unupdated New American Standard.
Yeah, what do they have?
1 through 6, 7 through 11, 12 through 16, 17 through 21, 22 through 24.
I did miss, there is a break in ESV 21 through 21 and 22. I missed.
So 17 through 21 and 22 through 24?
Yeah, I did miss that.
Okay, so, now, that's what we've got with our English translations. Now look at the text and answer this second question. What seems to be a logical textual marker? Don't want anybody to answer just yet. I want you to read through and see if you can find something that is maybe a repetitive word or a phrase that could very easily be determined as a textual marker. Okay, if you think you've seen something, then write down or type it in an open Word file how you would, if you were being asked to do the division of Psalm 71, how would you, from an exegetical point of view, redivide this psalm? I guess if you haven't gathered by now, you need to have more than your computer Bible in this class. You need to have your printed Bible as well. Okay, Dustin, what do you see?
Seeing it seems to change. So like he starts, in you, O Lord, I've taken refuge. He kind of goes on, then he seems to change, rescue me, O God. Seems like there's markers kind of throughout it.
Okay, so what is it that you're looking at here then as kind of
I'm still not 100% sure with it.
Denny, can I?
Yeah, jump right in.
I'm a little skittish after the last hour.
No, you were on the right track. You just didn't go far enough.
Oh, good. Well, this may be completely off, but what I see is he's saying in the very first section, "In you, O Lord, do I take refuge." So something that he does, and then the next section he's asking God to do something for him.
Which starts when?
Verse 4,
Okay.
"Rescue me, oh my God, from the hand of the wicked."
Good.
And then verse 7, he says something he has done. He has been as important to many. That's verse 7. And then the next section, he says again something God has done for him, and that's in verse 17. "From my youth you have taught me." And then the very last section, starting in verse 22, he says something he will do. "I will praise you with the harp." So it seems like he's saying, it's either he starts off saying something he's done, and then he's asking something from God. He's saying, "I've done this," and then he's asking something from God. And that's about as much as I've gathered.
Okay, he's on the right track. Go ahead.
I think, going off of what he says, I think those aren't really separate into sections. I think that he's saying what he's done, and because of that, he's asking something, and then it breaks. And then he says something is done, and he's asking, and then it breaks.
I think that's what I said, isn't it?
But you're on the right track, because if we're looking at this, and it's called a vocative, an "Oh God, oh Lord," is something that predominates in Psalm 71. So that seems to be a textual marker in this psalm. So if I'm going to break it down with the vocatives, and each vocative phrase begins a new section, then I've got "in thee, O Lord," is the first one, and that brings me down where?
4.
Through verse 3. Now, does anybody is there a Bible divided at between verse 3 and verse 4? Start a new paragraph?
Yep.
And that is what?
ESV.
ESV.
New King James.
All right, so New King James sees a breakdown. All right? So then you've got verse 4, "Rescue me, O my God, out of the grasp of the wrongdoer and ruthless man, for thou art my hope. O Lord God, thou art my confidence from my youth." Now, is it possible that verse 4 and verse 5a should be the next mini pericope, with verse 5b, "O Lord God," starting a new paragraph? Are you following what we're doing here?
Yeah.
All right, so if in fact that's what we did, how far would you go before you get to another vocative?
Through verse 11.
Yeah, through verse 11, you don't have another one until verse 12. "O God, do not be far from me. O my God, hasten to my help." So that would be the next section, and it would bring you down to where?
17.
Yeah, down through verse 16, and now you have another vocative in verse 17, and you've got one in verse 18, you've got one in 19, actually two in 19. So the question that I would be asking is, am I going to keep 17 through 21 together, or am I going to break each one of these vocatives into independent units? That's a question for study later on, as to whether you would or you wouldn't do that. But then verse 22, I will also praise thee with the harp, even thy truth, O my God. So there is yet another breakdown that you have that brings us through the rest of the chapter.
What
Now,
about O Holy One of Israel? Verse 22 at the end of it.
okay, so what would we do with that? Would we make that maybe a new, the start of a new pericope, or merge that in with the previous one? Good question. We don't. Right now, we're not trying to answer that. All we're doing is we're saying there's something going on with the vocative in Psalm 71. Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
And so, what's going on? And are these textual markers that are going to help us kind of divvy up and divide that? And the answer is yes. This is what exegetical work involves. When we're talking about this particular step of determining pericope, I'm just looking at the text, I'm saying, are there any markers here? And in narrative, it's going to be one thing. In poetry, it's going to be another thing. In prophecy, it's going to be another thing. But every genre has markers. You just got to know what to look for.
So in this one, though, the question then becomes is, does this, every time it's used, represent a different pericope? Certainly, it is breaking up somehow, but, so what do you do then? Do you try to just read the text and see if the thought seems to be a flowing unit still?
Yes. Like Dan brought up that we've got another vocative in the last part of verse 22. All right, so what is he talking about? I will also praise thee with the harp, even thy truth, O my God. To thee I will sing praises with the lyre, O thou Holy One of Israel. Does it sound like he's changing thoughts to you? No. So what would you do, Nathan?
Leave it together.
You'd leave it together. And you'd say, all right, the pericope covers verse 22, even though we've got more than one vocative that is in that section. But we're still talking about the same thing. And so if we back up to verses 17 through 21 that had 1, 2, 3, 4 vocatives, are they all basically talking about the same thing, or are they changing directions? And if they're changing directions, new pericope. If they're not changing directions or bringing up a new point, then we would keep it the same.
Okay, so based off verse 17 and 18, where there is the phrase, O God, twice. Verse 17, and I still proclaim your wondrous works. So, that's obviously tied to the preceding pericope. Because it's so even to old age. That's clearly tied, correct?
In verse 18?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think so, yeah. He's taught me from my youth to my old age. So the point still is that God has taught me. Now the question is, are we still talking about God teaching in verse 19, where we have our next vocative? For thy righteousness, O God, reaches to the heavens. Thou hast done these great things, O God, who is like thee? Thou who hast showed me. Is he still teaching?
Well,
in a way, he is, right? I mean, he's teaching me, he's showing me things. So we might say, yeah, I'm thinking 17 through 21 goes together. Now, at some level, this is a little bit subjective because we haven't really studied the psalm. We're just kind of doing a surface analysis. But anyway, we're picking up on these sort of things. Okay, you got your Bible open to 71. Jump over to 72. Let's do the same thing. Okay, who's got, Wayne, what version do you got there?
New American Standard.
Okay, what are the divisions of Psalm 72 that you've got?
It goes 1 through 4,
1 through 4,
5 through 7,
5 through 7,
8 through 11,
okay,
12 through 15,
12 through 15,
16 through 17,
okay,
18 and 19,
okay,
and then 20 on its own.
20 on its own. Anybody have anything different than that? How about you guys that have ESV? What?
Almost identical, but it goes from 12 to 14 in the ESV, then 15 to 17. So there was only that one difference where they included one verse there that we didn't.
Okay. Anybody see anything different than those two? Yeah, Dale?
The New King James goes from 1 to 4, from 5 to 7. Looks like from 8 to 11, 12 to 14, and then 15, 16, and 17 are all together by themselves, one verse each. And then 18 and 19 are together, and 20 is by itself.
So 15 are all their own pericope.
15, 16, and 17 are all, yeah. Separate.
They're all individual, separated from, okay.
Your King James or New King James? New King.
He's been converted.
All right, what is the textual marker that we have in Psalm 72?
May he.
Yeah, may he. You see that? Now, if we're looking at Psalm 72, focusing on this textual marker with the phrase may he, you've got the introductory statement, verse 1. Then the first pericope is verses 2 and 3. Then verse 4 and verse 5 go together. Now, if I heard everybody, every single one of our Bibles had a division between verse 4 and verse 5. But by spinning off of the may he phrase, really, verse 5 goes with verse 4. Yes?
They also, in the ESV at least, sometimes it goes from may he in verse 4, verse 2 and 4. In verse 5 it's may they. And then in verse 9 it's may deserts. Verse 10, may the kings. And so if you're breaking it up by maybe the pericope by what's going along with the may, is that?
Yeah, because we're focusing on the he. That's our primary spin-off there.
That's the bigger marker.
Yeah, that's That's the one that's repeated.
Would for he be
Like in 12, 14.
in verse 12? Because that's where mine splits.
No, I think we would want to stay with the word may.
Okay. So that would be, so from verse 8 until verse, I don't know.
15 maybe, so
Yeah,
maybe.
15, I think. Would that be your next one?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what you're going to find is verses 2 and 3 is focusing on his judgment. Verses 4 and 5 is going to talk about his vindication of the afflicted. Verses 6 and 7 are going to talk about what a blessing he should be to the people. Now, you're starting to see that, and this, by the way, is not a David psalm, but a Solomon psalm, that what Solomon is doing is he's trying to give us bullet points about, not God, but about the king. So this is a psalm about the king, and may the king be this kind of king. And you do have, may he, verse 15, may there be abundance in the grain. That is something that you might or might not want to isolate, like, Dale, what was that that you had? Was that ESV that did that?
New King James.
Like the New King James did. But verse 17 brings us right back to the may his type of thing. And then, interestingly, as we get to the end of the book, verse 19, and blessed be his glorious name forever, and may the whole earth be filled with his glory. So you wrap up with this this idea of may, but if we were going to redivide Psalm 72 and put it in pericopes or sections based upon an exegetical evaluation of this psalm, that's what we would have. We'd have verse 1, we'd have verses 2 and 3, we'd have verses 4 and 5, we'd have verses 6 and 7, then we'd have verses 8 through 11, 12 through 14. Again, I'm deviating from what the NAS has done.
Why verse 12?
No, sorry. 8 through 14. See, I automatically made the mistake that I'm trying to teach you not to make, and that is the fact that it had a division in my Bible just made me want to go there and divide it there. But there's not good reason to divide it there. Okay. Is this making sense to everybody, or are you just absolutely lost at what we're trying to do? Yeah.
Can I ask one question though on that? Why wouldn't you go through, or why wouldn't you stop at 12 though? Because it says, like, starting in 8, it says may he, and then it's 9, let the, 10, let the, 11, let all. But then 12 through 14 is for he will, he will. Would that not be a...
Yeah, and what you're doing is you're identifying subpoints. There's organization within subpoints. Because if we're going to make 8 to 14 one large pericope, you've got 8 through 11 being the first, based on what? Based on the let the phraseology, and then verses 12 and 14 based on the he will. You see what I'm saying? So you've still got the major division of the may he rule from sea to sea point. And if he's doing that, then what are the nomads going to do? What are the kings of Tarshish going to do? What are other kings going to do? Verse 11. And then verses 12 and 14, if he's ruling from sea to sea, what is he going to do with the needy? Verse 12. What's he going to do with the poor? Verse 13. and the oppressed, verse 13, and the oppressed, verse 14.
Okay.
So, very good. I'm glad you said that because I was going to blow right by it. But you will find when you start doing exegetical work that there are sections that have subpoints. Don't lose the major flow, but see that there's still structure even within subpoints as well.
I see with in verse 2, it's he will, verse 4, he shall, then it goes into verse 5, they shall. You wouldn't keep 1 through 4 separated from 5 because it's all about he shall, he will, and then once you get to 5, it's they shall fear, and then back in 6, it's back to he shall come down.
Yeah, because may he is our operative phrase, then the fact that there's a they shall thrown in there shouldn't throw us off track. We should stay with the may he terminology.
So you're saying that would be that would be the conclusion of that. So it would end at 5 and then start another one
at 6. Right, exactly.
So the focus is obviously on the king because of the repeated phrase, may he. These other things are just subpoints to how they are viewed in light of the king or his work or whatever.
All right. And that is what the Psalm 72 is all about. It's all about the king, what the king should do, what the king should be. Okay? Now, within that, if the king does what he's supposed to do, then the people should do this and be like that. Those are subpoints. The nation should respond to this king like this. But, now you've got a really good handle on Psalm 72. And, by the way, this is the psalm that I preached during an election year. No joke. You can preach Bible and make it something that gets people to think about our political climate. What kind of man do we want to lead? Well, here is an inspired psalm that's all about the ruler. It's all about the number one guy. And it's pretty cool. Very applicable. So put in your notes, preach Psalm 72 during election year. And send me a little note and thank me later. The idea. Yes.
So is the last pericope, how do you pronounce it? Pericope. Right. I forgot. From 15 all the way to the end?
I don't think so. I like to see 15, 16, and 17 as a separate unit. And I don't have a problem with making 17 go through 19. The problem is that when you look at 18 and 19, we're not talking about the king anymore. We're talking about God. And so 18 and 19 seems to be a conclusion to the psalm.
With that in mind, would 17 be 2 of them in and of itself? Because it has that phrase twice within that verse.
If we're talking about something different, potentially. May his name endure, may his name increase. So I would say no. We're talking about his name in both lines. So the point is still the same, and that is the name or the reputation of the king. Yeah.
Another thing, can we pretty well trust our translations as far as the capital letters, like he, big he, little he, in the Old Testament? I mean, those are pretty hard and fast.
Yeah, they're trustworthy.
Because that's another big break between 17 and 18. I mean, that transition from...
Yeah. And that's why, we're talking about the people that respect and honor the king, but in verses 18 and 19, especially verse 19, and may the holder be filled with his glory. I mean, now that we transition from the king, who is king over Israel, to the God of the whole earth. So I like that.
Switched your audience.
You switched, right, well, the subject really, from the king to God, the king of the whole world.
Okay. We're going through Isaiah, and there are a lot of passages where they've capitalized he to make it messianic, and we're seeing that it's not at all.
Yeah, actually, yeah. When we're talking about supposed messianic texts, you got to be careful about that, because they're seeing messianic texts crop up all over the place. And they're really not. Okay, let's do another one. Go to Judges 9. We'll get out of wisdom literature here and get into narrative. See if you can find structure in Judges chapter 9. What divisions are found in your version?
Are we looking at the whole chapter? I'm sorry. I didn't see it.
Okay, everybody look at your translation and see if your paragraph divisions are the same as what I've got. All right, we're talking about Judges chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, 7 through 15, 16 through 21, 22 through 25, 26 through 30, 30 through 29, 30 through 33, 34 through 41, 42 through 45, 46 through 49, 50 through 57. Anybody have a variation from that? Nathan?
Just the very beginning section, ours breaks it up, ESV breaks it up 1 through 2, then 3 through 6, but the rest are identical. So 1 and 2, and then 3 through 6. But the rest are identical.
Now, if I forget, remind me to come back around to that in a minute. Yeah.
The New King James goes from 34 to 30, the first part of 36, and then that but Zerubbabel goes from there to 38, and then 39 to 41. That's how it is online.
Yeah.
The NASB I have goes 1 through 3 and then 4 through 6.
1 through 3 and 4 through 6.
Yeah, and then, then the rest are lined up.
All right. So we see disparities here, and men are not agreeing on how this should be broken down. But asking the question from an exegetical point of view, are there any markers that you saw that might help us with division? Right?
Words like now and then.
All right. How many saw that? Now, if we're going to use the now and then as our divisions, what did you come up with, Wayne?
We'll go from 2 through 4, then 5 through 6, starting at 7 through 9. 10 and 11 will be together, 12 and 13 together, 14, 15 together, 16 looks all the way through 20 go together, 21 by itself, 22 by itself, and then 23 through 25, 26 through 29, 30 and 31 together, 32 through 34 together, 35 by itself, 36, 37 together, 38 through 40 together, 41 through 43 together, 44 through 45. And then I switched to when, so 46 through, actually that's where I ran out.
Okay. Now, that's a good place to start. Then, and you should have picked up this point from our discussion of Psalm 72, we might merge some verses together if what's happening? It's a continuation of thought. For example, verse 5. Then he went to his father's house at Ophrah. Well, that's probably not introducing a new pericope. We're talking about what Abimelech is doing, the activities of Abimelech and the worthless fellows, and the things that Abimelech is doing. Not necessarily a division within the text itself.
There's also divisions just based off the dialogue that we see. You know, there's a conversation at times, or there's a man speaking at times. When he's finished, there's a change in pericope.
Okay, case in point. Look at verse 10. This is the Jotham's allegory. And so then the tree said to the fig tree, well, you're not going to divide that up into a new pericope. That's a part of one continuous story. Verse 12, then the tree said to the vine, well, that's still part of the same story. So you're not going to divide those up.
Another big division was, and I saw it more towards like probably 26 and following. you have a major switch of characters. It's almost like, and I don't remember what they called it in the book, but you've got a parallel between two characters going side by side, and then eventually they.
Right. Okay, so we're talking about Abimelech, verse 22, but then we're going to talk about Gaal in verse 26. Then we're talking about Zebul in verse 30. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, and then back in, yeah, you're right. And then 34, we switch back to Abimelech.
Right.
I don't know, maybe it's a stretch.
No, not a stretch at all. Those are markers. And so we got the inspired writer of Judges who is navigating us through various events that are taking place with numerous individuals. And, all right, let's talk about this guy for a while. Let's go back to this guy for a while.
I picked up on the then and now, but I also picked up on when. They went to Shechem, verse 1. They went to his father's house, verse 5. They went, stood on top of the mountain, verse 7. Went to Ger, verse 21. Went to the field, verse 26. And I saw that as another possibility.
Yeah, and that would make sense to look at that because is that the way he's approaching this? Is he saying, all right, they went here, let's talk about what happened there. And then they went here, let's talk about what happened there. That's a fair question. I mean, we're seeing kind of a repetitive prayer. I don't think that's what's happening in this chapter, that the went is really their markers, but that's still the right question to ask and say, is that really kind of how he's splitting this up or not? I do think that the nows and the thens are the textual markers that we have in this chapter. And so if those are the textual markers, then we've got a problem with verses 34 and 35. Because verse 34 is identified as a new chapter break, whereas 35 is not. But if we're following what he's been doing, now Abimelech, now Gaal, well, now he's back to now Gaal again. So I would think that 35 should begin a new pericope. Now, here's why this is important. This is going to impact the way that you do exegetical work on this text. Because now you're merging verse 34 with what went before, and you're starting now a transition to talk about what Gaal is doing in verse 35. Which actually, having taught and studied this section for years, is exactly what's going on. Verse 34 and 35 should not go together. He's transitioning back to Gaal in verse 35. But if we're using our paragraph markers, we're gonna get a little bit off track on that. Yeah, Nate.
I know you talked about this in the past, but here's just an example of it. The ESV doesn't have that same word, so it's easy to brush over. We don't have in verse 35 now or then.
What do you have?
And Gael, the son of Ebed, when he stood out. So instead of, did you guys say you had the word now?
Yeah. So do you have now in verse 22? Or do you have in?
Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years. That's all verse 22 says.
Yowza. You don't have either an ow or an in?
No, sir.
What about verse 26?
And Gael, the son of Ebed, moved.
And verse 30?
When Zebul ruled, we heard. Well, there was a wind in that one.
So you like ESV even less now?
Yeah, that's messing up. Because there are words in Hebrew that they're not translations. And so that's not helping us. Yeah.
King James is very similar to what Nathan just read. I mean, they don't have the now and then.
And with Hebrew, all we're talking about is one letter that's in front of the predominant verb, and it's just called a vav. You just got a vav. And the vav can be translated and or now. So I'm not arguing a translation. I'm arguing that it needs to be represented every single time, consistently, because by it being represented every single time, now we're seeing what the Hebrew has as divisions, and we need our English to show us that these transitions are there.
We were missing it in 2 of the verses that you asked about.
Yeah, sounds like it. But didn't you say that they still had a paragraph marker at verse 22 and verse 26?
There is.
Yeah, so they saw something, and maybe it was the name of an individual like Abimelech and Gaal that made them do that. But there was more to it than just a new name to introduce a new section. All right, let's, while we've got our Bibles open,
Brother Denny?
look at chapter 10. Do the same thing.
Sorry, you had asked me to remind you to go back to the beginning part of chapter 9.
Yeah, oh yeah, don't go to 10 yet. So, what is it that you would see, looking at this text from an exegetical point of view, what would you see as a reason to divide? Was it 2 from 3?
It goes verses 1 and 2, 3 is a second separate pericope.
What do you see the difference in verses 2 and 3 that would warrant or justify making verse 3 the beginning of a new pericope?
And his mother.
You have that thing you just told us in the Hebrew language is there, and or whatever.
But is that what he's doing in this chapter? I mean, is that just by having and in and of itself isn't going to, otherwise you're basically going to have every single verse be a pericope unto itself.
It's changing just changing from Abimelech to the relatives.
You have a complete shift of a scene.
Well, you don't. And here is something that kind of train yourself when you see stuff like this, like when I'm grading your term papers and you begin a new paragraph with a demonstrative pronoun, these or that, I'm going to call you on it every single time, because that is always a writing blunder. You never begin a new paragraph with a these or that or this. You have to, when you begin a paragraph, you have to re-identify subject. Re-identify subject. Now, in verse 3, and his mother's relatives spoke all these words. What words? The words that are in verse 2. You're not going to be making a break there. That's not a change in pericope. These words, what words? The words that we just gave you. So, there's not justification for identifying verse 3 as a new pericope. And the demonstrative pronouns is one of the evidences I would use to argue that. But anyway, those are the kind. All we're doing, and do not get frustrated at this point. You're saying, all right, I'm not getting this, or I'm not quite seeing what Denny's seeing. That's okay. That's not really the purpose of the exercise. The purpose of the exercise is to start training yourself to ask questions. What is there? What are you seeing that might be a division? And I just don't see anything in verse 3. So I would not agree with the division there. Okay, go to, yeah.
Did you say there was, for yours, did you divide 6 and 7?
7 is the beginning of a new one.
Well, what about the when they? Wouldn't that be part of 6? Because giving the names all over.
Yeah, you could say, you're gonna merge that, but
So then it
also
would
we're
end with-
looking at the now whens. Okay, go to Judges 10, not as long a chapter.
Again,
Yes.
could you throw a cause and an effect in here too? From 1 through 33? What he's doing and the effect of afterwards, the killing and the battles going on? Or would that serve any purpose at all?
It possibly could. You could say, or is he trying to group a string of events that took place that led to this catastrophic result? And say, basically, I'm dividing the chapter into two parts. The string of events, and then the catastrophic result. That'd be good. Okay, just got a couple minutes left. What are you seeing?
Same thing. Got a now and then 3 thens.
A now, and then you've got three thens. But you've got more than 3 thens. Thens. You have a phrase, don't you?
Died.
Then the children.
Then the children. So that makes it even more rock solid that that's a textual marker and a division. Now, does anybody have, besides me, a new paragraph marker in verse 3?
Yeah.
Now, does that make any sense to anybody? All we're doing is we're going through a list of guys that came after Abimelech. Tola verse 1, J.R. verse 3, and basically that's that. So the only logic would be the fact that we've gone from Tola to J.R., but there is nothing with that textual marker, like in you have the now in verse 1, that really goes with the now of chapter 9. Then the children, or then the sons, verse 6. Then the sons, verse 10. Then the sons, verse 17. Those are textual markers, very logical points within this text itself.
So yours has, verse 17, then the sons, because the ESV says, then the Ammonites were called.
The son.
Which verse?
Verse
Verse
17.
17. Yeah, should be then the sons. Or,
Okay, the second part of 17 says, and the people of Israel. So that's
See-
how, ours doesn't say sons, ours uses
Ours
the
says,
phrase
and the
people. So that's our marker then, the people of Israel.
yeah. And that actually is a case in point of what I'm talking about, of consistently translating things. Because you kind of miss that. Without the then the sons repeated phrase, you might blow right by.
Our repeated phrase is the people of Israel. It's repeated that phrase 3 times.
Oh, it is, okay, I'm sorry.
I just overlooked it.
Then that's fine.
Okay.
So you had the people in verse 6 and the people in verse 10.
10 and 17.
Okay, good. All right, we'll pick up there. Actually, we are,